So let's stand together, shall we, as we read our passage this morning from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. And I'll be reading from my book here, which is the New International Version. And it says, "When I come to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness, in fear, and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. We do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age, or the rulers of this age, who are coming to nothing. No, we speak of God's secret wisdom, a wisdom that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. However, as it is written, no eye has seen, nor ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love Him. But God has revealed it to us by His Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God." Please be seated. Well, it's a great passage as we think about this week. Now, this week is sort of like in sort of that gray zone of the year, isn't it? Christmas is over, but New Year's hasn't kicked in yet. And so for me, it's kind of that next week, you won't see me much because I sort of go find a hole someplace and think deep thoughts and plan my year. That's kind of what I do. And so I'm looking forward to that. So this message is usually for me kind of a launch point for us to think about what is it that God has done in the past, and where is it God is leading us for the next 12 months? If we're going to be intentional in how we live our lives, I mean, how does that work? And so this passage provides a framework as we look back at what God has done for a moment, because what God has done is the fuel for what God will do. If you've seen God at work in your life in the past, that creates a momentum that gives you the confidence that He'll continue to work in you in the future. So what has God done? Well, just to review quickly some of the things that have happened that we decided, some of the goals that we had for last year. One of them is that some of you have noticed that my hair is either getting gray or disappearing. And so we thought it might be a good idea to get some younger blood on the staff. And so we're going to begin, effective the first week of January, our search for a student pastor. Hopefully we can hire him by June of this year. And so we've approved the hiring of that student life pastor or youth pastor, whatever. We'll figure out what we're going to call him later. And we'll be reorganizing the staff as a result to reflect his entrance on our team. So we're looking forward to that. The second thing is we refocused our vision. The words and the focus that we had for Crossroads when we first began 21 years ago now was for 21 years ago. So we reworked it. And we put it someplace where it's hard to ignore. Anybody notice where it is? It's like right there on the wall. Yeah. And, so what are we about? People say, well, what's Crossroads about? We are about inviting people to follow Jesus. Now, we want to invite the whole world, but God's put us in St. Clair, Michigan, in China Township, this little place on the globe. He's given us responsibility for and sharing the good news and moving out from there. And so we did the research, we made the decision, we've changed our materials to reflect the new logo, and we had some fun with that. For those of you who were involved, that did something I had never done before and it was a lot of fun. We had a good time. And so we displayed the new logo and the vision in a place that's easily noticed. We'll see how long it takes you before you begin to take it for granted, right? Just walk in, oh, I forget that's there. It's human nature. It's what we do. That's why we need to keep talking about why we exist. And we'll continue to emphasize that we exist to invite the world to follow Jesus through our preaching, teaching, and in our practice. As I was talking to Randy this morning, he said, it looks really good, and let's see how well we do living it out. The description of our plan to live out this will show up in 3 basic ways in 2015, and we'll unpack these more, but we'll use the word of Jesus, the way of Jesus, and the work of Jesus to describe that, and looking forward to fleshing that out more as the year unfolds. And so what do we do for next year? Okay, this is what God has done, and what's happening next year. How do you look at the next 12 months of your life? And I think about my own life. I think, I'm 57, and I'm not going to live forever, and so I want to live more with a focus and a purpose now, perhaps, than I've ever done. This passage provides a framework, actually the first 4 verses of what we read. And the first thing I notice, as you think about your life in the next 12 months, how much of what Paul suggests in his construct do you want to live out and apply to your own life? Think about that as I walk through them briefly. When I came to you, brothers, I did not come to you with eloquence or superior wisdom. Paul is saying to his Corinthian brothers and sisters who were in this place in Corinth, and the church wasn't doing real well. They had a lot of conflict and issues, and that's the whole purpose of the book. But he said that when I come to you, I want to highlight God's story, not my story. I want to come to you not as someone who has, I'm so stinking smart, I can't bloody stand it. That's what he wants to get away from. Now, Paul, you recall, is educated in the Yale or Harvard of the day. And in various parts of Scripture, he quotes philosophers. And he could have come across as one who had a handle on all the philosophies of the day and sounded really important and impressive. But he said, you know what? I don't want to talk about me or my opinions. I want to talk about his story. And I want to do so from a posture of humility. Not my lofty words, not my wisdom or my opinions. Rather, I want to declare with heavenly authority this plan of salvation that formerly was kept secret, but now has been made known to us. And the word declare or proclaim is the word used to describe how angels talk about coming to us with a message from God. There's a sense of authority. When the angel Gabriel showed up, we just kind of reviewed all this over the Christmas season I bring you good news of great joy, right? Well, Gabriel's the one who stands in the presence of God. When he speaks, he brings with him the authority of God himself, right? That's the word used here. Paul says, when I talk to you about the gospel of Jesus Christ, I'm not giving you what I think. I'm telling you what God says. And with that comes a sense of authority and authenticity that otherwise wouldn't be there. And this formerly secret plan, it actually means to be hidden under a blanket. You're hiding somebody under a blanket or something and you pull it back. And that's the image used to describe how that there was a point in time when the good news of the gospel, God's plan of redemption, like they were really confused about Jesus. People are still confused about him. Paul wasn't confused. And he'll talk more about who he is. So he highlights God's story. That's the first thing I notice. So when I have this opportunity this year, I can talk about me. I mean, I know I'm wonderful and all of that. But when it comes to Jesus, compared to me, compared to us, it's actually how he has intersected with us that's a story worth telling. That's the story. Highlight God's story. So when you have a chance to talk to folks, how is it that you want to talk? Who do you want to talk about? Well, Paul goes on actually to unpack this a little more. He says in verse 2, "For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." Now is Paul saying I don't know anything but Jesus and him crucified? No. He says, what is what I want to talk to you about? You guys have kind of fallen off the rails a little bit. You're all in sort of 50 different directions. Let's kind of bring our focus in on who really matters. You ever feel that way? like life's sort of gone off the rails and you've lost your focus and like, where do I start? You start with Jesus. And of course, we're tempted to sort of pack all of life on this big cart and then somehow try to stuff Jesus in there. It doesn't work, does it? Well, maybe this year, because most of us do life like that. It's just the way it seems to happen. Maybe we'll take one thing out of the cart and put Jesus in front of that. Start there. Instead of emptying the whole cart. Just one piece, one spot. Think about that. Here's what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about Jesus. I want to share, for I resolved, he said, he made a decision. It's the word to decide. I decided that I want to focus on Christ and him crucified. And so there's lots of elements about the life of Jesus that Paul could have talked about. His birth, his resurrection, his incarnation, and all sorts of shunned words, right? But he says, I want to talk to you about the fact that Jesus hung on a cross for your sin. That's what I want to talk about. And I want you to be comfortable with understanding that you cannot find salvation in and of yourself. It's only through the crucified Jesus who gave himself as a sacrifice for your sin and mine that makes my connection with God and this thing called eternity possible. And of course, the world around me says, oh, not really. You don't have to decide that. Paul says, I'm making a decision to know nothing the whole time I was with you, he says, except I want to talk about Jesus and him crucified. And he says, he uses the word Jesus, which is a way of describing the humanity. Jesus was a guy. He was born in a stable, came out of this woman like the rest of us, and he had this humanity about him. Probably had favorite foods. Probably had foods that he didn't want to eat, like broccoli and Brussels sprouts. Who knows? The Middle Eastern version of that, I don't know. But if he was human, and he was the God-man, and Paul puts them together. He says he's the Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the King, who we read about in our call to worship. And the reign of his government will never end. Well, if he's the King, guess who we are? We're the subjects of his kingdom, if we want to be. Share Jesus and him crucified. He allowed his execution so that he could take my place for my sin. He paid my price. And by the way, if Jesus paid the price for your sin, that means you don't have to pay it anymore. Think about that. So this year, highlight God's story in your life. How has the good news intersected with your life? That's the story worth talking about. And when you talk about Jesus and his life, you share about the fact that he died on the cross for your sin. And then he says, I came to you in verse 3 in weakness and fear and with much trembling. Now, Paul was, as we could say, high speed, low drag kind of Pharisee, a Jew among Jews. This guy had a pedigree that really nobody could match. And he could have showed up and said, gentlemen, I am Paul the Apostle. Aren't you lucky? Instead, he said, you know what? I realize my limitations in my connecting with you, my weakness, which means instead of coming across as physically powerful, like warrior strong kind of thing, he was acting physically unimpressive. I'm not here to confront you, have a fight, pick a fight. I said, I came to you in fear, the kind of stop dead in your tracks kind of fear, the kind of fear that literally paralyzes you from moving forward. And then he says, trembling. You're just not sure if you should be going this way or not. And so you're sort of, maybe I will. Maybe there's a sense of uncertainty rather than a sense of confidence and strength. He chose a posture of humility and limited his own personal story, his own personal influence, his own personal presence in an effort to glorify Jesus, because he's the one who can change a life. Recognize your limitations. Recognize one of the most fundamental limitations is that you have a birthday. A bunch of folks around here had birthdays in the last week. And then you have a death date coming. There is a limitation that you cannot control. And so, do you live your life intentionally, with purpose, as a result? You only have so much time. You only have so many gifts and so many abilities. You have limitations. How do you take what God has called you to do and marry it with what the limitations that God has built into our experience? And to use those limitations for His glory. The need for prioritizing, the need for rest, the need for nourishment, all reflect limitations that God has placed on us. And when we ignore them, we pay a price. Some sooner than later. Sin limits our prayer lives. Selfishness limits our ability to function effectively for the Lord. Doubting it sets to limit our ability to follow God. And a lack of godly wisdom creates conflict and uncertainty. I'm on the tail end of about a 12-month journey of doing this life coaching, counseling, training. It's basically a skill development process so that I can be more effective in helping you do life. And part of the process is I have to, become a client. So, Reverend, let's talk about you. And so they're talking about me. You know how uncomfortable that is, right? Because, when people get in, they start poking around. Why don't we turn that rock over? Oh, what's that about? Well, why don't we just kind of skip that rock, right? And they asked me a question that I've been carrying around with me for a few months. And they said to me, as you look at your life and what you want to do and what you believe you're supposed to be doing, what are you putting up with in your life? Something you know isn't healthy. Something you know doesn't really help you get where you believe God wants you to go. And yet, because you're afraid of the consequences of facing it, you've just learned to live with it. What are you putting up with? What kind of limitations are you imposing on yourself because of the fear that Paul describes in the passage? Now, the problem with asking me that question is I knew the answer right away. How would you answer that question? And how does the answer to that question have a bearing on how you'll live your life in the next 12 months? 2015 is a great year to face your fears. And how do we face our fears? By trusting in the power of God. Notice the passage. It says, my message or the words that I shared with you and my proclamation, my preaching, were not with wise and persuasive words. Although, in parentheses, you could hear Paul saying, I'm really pretty good at wise and persuasive words. I am quite persuasive. Trust me. But I don't want you to trust me. I want you to trust Him. Notice the passage goes on. But with a demonstration, instead of the wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. That means a visually recognizable event that can only be the power of God at work. So if I'm going to face my fears in the coming year, really the only way to do that is in the power of the Spirit of God. So out of that kind of connection comes this question: have I asked God to apply the Spirit's power in this area that I'm fearing the most? Paul's goal at the end is that so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom. And it's literally so that you don't trust in the wisdom of the people around you, but that you trust in the power of God. And it's the word we get dynamite from. And you could play around with that some. If you want to make a bang for Jesus in 2015, then trust the power of God. That's the word picture there. If you want to trust it, and it's also translated ability. It's God's power and ability. Which means if you trust Him, then you're not trusting in yourself. It doesn't mean you ignore the giftings and the passions that God's given you, but you put them to work under the power that He provides. Trust God's power. Faith that rests on the power of God. When was the last time you saw a demonstration of the Spirit's power in your life? The problem with this job is that I have to answer those questions before I get up here. You're just hearing them. I've been stewing about them all week. But I asked myself the question at the last training event we had with this discipleship crew we hooked up with. They asked this question in a different way. They said, are you open to the miraculous power of God in your life? Or are you afraid of it? The weird stuff that might happen. As you define weird. What if we began to ask God for a demonstration of His power? And I'm not talking about the usual kind of crazy stuff that I think about when I hear that phrase go off in my head. But did you know that if you're stuck in a rut and you have all of these issues and problems and fears and stuff of life that every one of us have, that the key to overcoming those, not just coping with them, but overcoming them, lies in a reliance on the Spirit of God's power. Have you asked God to apply the Spirit of power to your struggle? Now, what do you think would be different among us is if between now and, say, the first Sunday in January, we began to say, Lord, help me to see your power at work in my life. Demonstration of Spirit's power and faith in God's power and ability. Paul could have talked for hours about the philosophy of the day. As I mentioned, he quotes the Cilician Aratus poems in Acts 17, Epimenides and Titus and Meandrin in 1 Corinthians 15, but he knew that human philosophy is not what changes people's lives. It's the transforming power of Christ and Him crucified. So as you look at your life and the passions and the abilities and the talents and the interests that God has given you for 2015, how does He want you to live it out in light of His payment for your sin and in light of the power that He provides for you to walk in that calling of life? Let me just, it kind of wraps up like this. Let me say it another way, and with this we'll move into the Lord's Supper. In 2015, Paul's message to the Corinthians is encouraging us to do 4 things. One is to give our testimony. How has God made a difference in your life? What if you decided to tell one of your friends a month? Just one a month. Now, how about every 2 weeks? Or how about one a week? I don't know. What if you just decide, did you know, I've had some exciting things going on in my life, and can I tell you about them? Choose your focus. What are you going to focus on? It's an actual decision that has lasting effects. This thing I chose, I resolved to know nothing among you except Christ and Him crucified. He made a decision to take within the framework of his daily life, which included all sorts of things: preaching, teaching, making tents, talking to philosophers. The whole thing was pointed at Jesus. Choose your focus. Where are you going to focus this year? Third is to face your fears. What are you afraid of? That the power of God's Spirit can help you overcome. And fourthly, there's an invitation there to seek God's power. To seek His power, not yours. I mean, we're all pretty smart, pretty intelligent, pretty gifted, pretty impressive people, aren't we? Just ask us. But how about if we began to turn our attention to the power of the living God, the Christ, Him crucified? You think about that. I wonder what that difference will look like in 2015 for us, because that's the essence of the gospel. If before you leave today you'd like to talk to this Lord of all, and we'll be up here to pray with you, to greet you, and join you in prayer. And if you're ready to go, then hear the words of benediction. And now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, equip you with everything good for doing His will. And may He work in us what is pleasing to Him through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen.